The Wheel and the Butterfly. Written by Justice4243 and read by Sunguard. Red Moonguard, but lovely. Chapter 8. Pinky vs. Disguises. Dan reached into his pocket and grabbed his keys. Lenny's, huh? Well, that isn't far. I can easily... Dan narrowed his eyes as he noticed the lock indicator was up on his car door. Great, Dan muttered to himself. Must have left the car unlocked when I checked it this morning. Dan opened the car door and peered inside. Well, it seems to be devoid of glitter. Doesn't matter. I'm going to find her and make her pay. Without hurting her. Or arranging for her to be hurt. And Chris and his threat of violence and / or legal action. Well, she heard something I loved. I'll just have to find something of hers and hurt it back. Dan grinned evilly to himself behind the wheel of his car. He started it and pulled out into traffic.
Nice car, tough guy,
someone called from the street. I will find you and make orphans of your children, Dan shot back. He didn't have to travel far before spotting Chris's blue sedan at a gas station. He said out loud. Maybe this will be quicker than I thought. He pulled around the back of the station and exited his car. He began to peer around the corner and...
Hey, girl car, you can only park here if you're filling your tires with air.
Dan turned around to see a dark olive, lanky gas station attendant in a gray jumpsuit shooting him a dirty look from the air pump Dan had unwittingly parked next to. Ah, my good man, perhaps you can assist me, Dan said with a smile. Dan put his arms around the man and brought him around to the back of his car. I believe there is a quarter in the back of my car. If you would be so kind as to help me look. Chris leaned idly by the side of his car and watched the numbers on the gas pump slide up.
So nice to talk to someone about a lease without having to hear about how my marriage was a mistake, for a change.
Pinky awed and oohed at pretty much any unfamiliar sight, which was still pretty much everything at this point.
Well, things should certainly be quieter without Dan. I just hope I can keep things from getting awkward. Still, Pinky is pretty good at holding a conversation, and...
Chris's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar sound, a sound he quite wished he couldn't identify based upon helping Dan time and time again. Ooh, what's that? Pinky asked with a smile, inquiring about the rhythmic pounding sound.
Oh, that's nothing,
Chris said with a nervous smile.
Could you excuse me for a second? I have to go around that corner. That corner right over there.
Chris pointed to the back of the building.
For no reason in particular.
Okie dokie Loki, Pinky said with a trusting smile. Chris rounded the corner of the station to be greeted by the familiar sight of Dan knocking someone senseless with the hatch of his car over and over again.
Dan, stop! I think you got him!
Dan looked up at his friend Chris and let go of the very unconscious man in his grip. Chris, old buddy, how's it going? Dan asked enthusiastically and started undressing the gas station attendant.
Dan, what do you think you're doing? Chris
asked, afraid he already knew the answer. Why, revenge, of course, what else? Dan said, grinning with a mouthful of pointed teeth. Chris put on an annoyed expression, sighed, and rolled his eyes.
What else indeed?
Now, Chris. Dan roughly dropped the gas station attendant, now sans jumpsuit, with Dan proceeded to try on. I know you said some things to me that you regret, and I want you to know, Dan finished putting on the very loose-fitting jumpsuit, that I forgive you, and I think it's best if we... Dan reached over and opened the door to the gas station bathroom. Put aside our differences for the sake of vanquishing... Dan stuffed the unconscious man in the bathroom and tried closing the door, pushing it shut with the full weight of his body, and a grunt when it became apparent the unconscious man was in the way of closing the door fully. A common foe. Come on, buddy, it'll be just like old times. Dan put out his hand and smiled wide.
No, Dan. Just no,
Chris said, quickly making an X with his arms and throwing them to the side. Oh, come on! You don't even know who...
There is no way I'm going to help you get back at Pinkie Pie,
Chris said sternly. But look at what she did to my car! Dan insisted, motioning to his pink and bedazzled hatchback.
Dan, if you actually looked at that for more than a second...
Chris walked over, dragged his finger over the hood, and held up his now pink finger in one quick motion.
You'll find this stuff comes off if it drizzles.
It too, Chris? Wait, you helped her, didn't you? Dan said accusingly.
Oh, Dan, calm down.
No! If you won't help me get my revenge...
Revenge against what?
Chris and Dan both jumped slightly in their feet and turned towards a smiling, pink-haired girl who'd snuck up behind them. Pinky still had smudges of pink paint on her face. Dan quickly turned away, looked down, rubbed his index finger in a black oil puddle, held it between his nose and upper lip, and turned to face Pinky. "Good day, madame. It's just me, your helpful local gas station attendant," Dan said, trying desperately to disguise his voice by dropping it an octave. Pinky squinted at the helpful local gas station attendant's chest. "Juan?" "Yes, it's me, Juan," Dan said, quickly dancing from side to side pensively.
It says John,
Chris said flatly. "What?" Dan said, his voice returning to its normal enraged tone. "You can't even pronounce— yes, that's my name." "Well, Juan," Pinky said with a knowing smile, glancing at the pink bedazzled hatchback, "what brings you out here?" "Oh, you know," Juan said, desperately thinking of an innocent response. "Gas station stuff." "Oh, hey!"
Oh, hey, that reminds me.
Chris spoke up.
My windows are a bit dirty. Mind taking care of that for me, Juan?
Juan grumbled angrily and glared at Chris. "Jerk, no, he's going to blame my cover, though." "Of course, wait right here." Juan turned on his heels and dropped his mustache and angrily made his way to Chris's car. Pinky followed Juan with her eyes and smiled impossibly wide. "Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh," she shrieked in excitement. "Dan likes disguises? I love disguises!"
Yeah, that Dan. Always dressing up as someone.
"He almost fooled me, too," Pinky said, eyelids dropping slightly and her smile changing to that one proud of herself.
Oh?
Chris asked in a surprised tone. Someone would have to be pretty dense to not see through Dan's disguise. "Yeah," Pinky cooed, "but you forgot one small detail," she added matter-of-factually. Pinky placed her palm on the hood of Dan's car and smiled to herself. She then lifted it and gazed at her palm, realizing she had just turned it pink. "Whoops." Juan returned, mustache held against his lip, wielding a squeegee. He quickly swung it over his shoulder, splashing Chris in the process.
"Hey!"
Chris said, leveling an irritated glance at Juan. "Your car is all ready to go." "Thanks, Juan," Pinky said. "Oh, we're going to have to go to Lenny's down the street. Would you like to come with us? We'd love to have your company," Pinky said, raising her eyebrows knowingly. I would, but..." Dan struggled to think of a convincing excuse. "I'm allergic to, food." Chris raised his eyebrows.
You could have just said you still had work to do.
"Yeah, that too." "Oh, well," Pinky trailed off. "Oh, pictures!" Pinky wrapped her arm around Juan's neck and snapped a picture of the two of them. "Great, now you take one, Chris." Pinky handed the camera to Chris, who smiled and said,
"Say cheese."
Pinky smiled wide and said, "Cheese." Juan silently glared at Chris. Pinky looked down at her camera excitedly, then looked up. "See you around, Danny. Juan." She bounded back to the car with a tra-la-la-la-la. "I think she bought it," Dan said to Chris.
Dan, will you stop this nonsense and just join us for lunch?
"And break bread with the enemy? I think not," Dan said coldly, crossing his arms. "And don't think I'm going to let this act of betrayal slide." Dan angrily climbed into his car.
"Fine,"
Chris said, also crossing his arms.
"See you at Lenny's." "Oh,"
Chris grinned.
"you may want to hide your pink car next time,"
Chris said, pointing at the hood. Dan frowned and looked at his windshield, noticing an effeminate-looking handprint on the hood of his car. He buried his face in his palm, mumbled something obscene, started his car, and drove off. "I'll have to step up his game with this one. She's clearly much smarter than she looked." Chris shook his head and started walking back to his car and an awaiting Pinkie Pie. The bathroom door flew open behind him. "Why does everything taste like pennies?" a terrified, half-naked gas station attendant inquired. Chris went pale, emitted a perturbed and made his way back to his car. Pinky was beyond giddy at this point. "Oh, what do you think he'll put on next? Oh, maybe he'll show us as our waiter. Oh, or maybe a cook."
"Well, sometimes with Dan you have to expect the unexpected."
Chris dwelled on this for a second.
Okay, actually, always with Dan you have to expect the unexpected.
Chris pulled into the parking lot and exited the car. Pinky crossed her arms on the roof of the car and rested her head for a second, then perked up. "Clown! No, person. No, wait!" Pinky shrieked with delight, holding her finger up in an aha pose. "A walrus!" She turned her body and wrung her hands, narrowing her eyelids. No one ever suspects the walrus, she said with a knowing grin.
Uh-huh.
Chris said. It began to dawn on him he had swapped out one crazy friend for another flavor of crazy. He walked to the entrance, holding the door open for Pinkie Pie. Pinkie walked in, but still had the same knowing grin plastered on her face as she scanned the restaurant, and aha! Pinkie pointed to a tall waiter in a long white coat with short, stubby arms, who looked like he was having a lot of trouble balancing and holding his order of food. Nice try, Dan, but you have to try better than the all stilts and long coat routine to outsmart this pone. Pinkie threw open the coat to reveal it was, in fact, 3 men with dwarfism posing as a single individual. The trio teetered and crashed into a nearby table, splattering food all over the occupants and themselves. Chris sat down at a booth and shielding his eyes, hoping no one noticed him.
Yeah, definitely just a new kind of crazy. Wait, why were there 3 men with dwarfism posing as a waiter?
Pinkie sat down from Chris and started twiddling her thumbs. This is hard, she announced, staring down at her hands. Their waitress came by and wordlessly dropped a couple of menus and waters. Chris quickly opened his and buried his head in it. Pinkie grabbed hers and started poring over it and inhaled as she glanced at a page. You can order breakfast all day? She asked excitedly. Chris lowered his menu.
Yep, I'm going to order the home run special and a double bacon cheeseburger.
He said proudly.
If that's okay with you, of course.
He added, realizing he wasn't paying for a change. Of course, Pinkie said in a squeaky voice. It's the least I can do for last night. Just then, Pinkie inhaled a seemingly impossible amount of air. Good afternoon, friends. A short, unshaven, mustachioed man with a soul patch and a top hat, tuxedo, and gray pants greeted Pinkie and Chris. Chris and Pinkie stared blankly at him until Pinkie quickly brought her camera up, snapped a quick photo, and just as quickly put it in her bag. For one brief, shining second, the world was replaced by the dapper-looking gentleman in front of her. Would you two do me the honor of letting me dine with you this fine day? Oh, yes, Pinkie said. Chris rolled his eyes as a well-dressed gentleman sat next to him. The gentleman doffed his hat at Pinkie. My name is Moneybags. Mr. Moneybags. Pinkie beamed with delight and held out her hand. My name is Pinkie Pie, she exclaimed. Rather than shake it, Mr. Moneybags gently took Pinkie's hand and gave her knuckles a tiny peck. Pinkie let out an audible eeeeee of delight. Chris simply continued to look perturbed with his head in the menu. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself to the nice man? Pinkie asked. Chris set his menu down, crossed his arms, and simply glared down at the well-dressed man sitting next to him. Chris, that is not how we make friends, Pinkie said in a maternal tone. Chris narrowed his eyes at Pinkie, sighed, and extended a hand to Mr. Moneybags. Mr. Moneybags took it and gave it a firm shake. Charmed, I'm sure. The waitress returned, placed a water in front of the well-dressed man, and coldly asked, Are you ready to order? Chris ordered his Michelin burger. Pinkie ordered an endless stack of pancakes and some French toast, and Mr. Moneybags ordered a turkey sandwich, no cheese, and no vegetables. The waitress took their order and gave Pinkie a funny look as she walked off. Pinkie furrowed her brow and looked back at the 2 men sitting across from her.
Pinkie,
Chris whispered.
your face.
Pinkie reached up only to smear more pink paint on her face. Whoops, silly me. Be right back. She dashed for the restroom. Chris exhaled and looked down at Mr. Moneybags.
Dan, where did you get that outfit?
Chris asked, arms crossed. I spotted a Monopoly promotion a few blocks over when I hid my car. The 75th anniversary or something. I rolled the mascot, Dan answered, grinning to himself. These clothes fit perfectly and they look amazing.
Dan, this is ridiculous. Why don't you just try being her friend?
Chris asked, throwing his hands out in front of him, palms turned up. Because, Dan insisted, she's the enemy. Dan's face twisting into a sneer.
You know, she caused 3 dwarfs to drop a full tray of food on a table.
Huh? Dan replied, cocking an eyebrow.
She was trying to look for you and...
Chris clenched his eyes shut, leaned his head down, and clenched the bridge of his nose with a thumb, forefinger, and middle finger.
It sounds crazy even describing it. It's exactly the sort of thing you would do.
Before Dan could respond, Pinkie bounded back to the table with a happy grin and sat back down. So, Mr. Moneybags, tell us about yourself. Dan put back on his old money voice and regaled the table with the delights of being rich and owning multiple properties, houses and hotels, and being in between bouts of Pinkie taking photos of everyone at the table and forcing the staff to snap photos as well. Before long, the food had arrived, and Chris hungrily dug in. Mr. Moneybags opened his sandwich and sighed disappointedly, staring at the bright rectangular yellow blemish on the sandwich. Pinky looked at the sandwich, frowned, and stood up. She walked over and put her hand on Mr. Moneybags' shoulder and smiled warmly at him. "I'll take care of this, Dapper Dan, man." Pinky grabbed the plate that was in front of Dan, walked into the kitchen, and... "What's a big idea? Are you trying to kill someone? No cheese, no cheese! Do you understand you just put poison in a man's food? How many people have you killed with your carelessness? How much blood is on your hands? Make it again, and don't embarrass yourselves this time." Chris and Dan's jaws dropped, though Chris recovered quickly enough to continue eating. Dan continued gawking at Pinky until she sat down across from him and Chris. "They said they'd make you a new one and get it out to you in a jiffy," Pinky said sweetly, pulling her lips up into an audible squee. She grabbed a slice of plain white toast from a plate in front of her and took a small bite. "Toast?" she asked, sliding the plate towards Dan. Dan regained his senses long enough to grab a slice and start nibbling on it. Within a matter of minutes, a new cheeseless, vegetable-less turkey sandwich was in front of him, which he happily consumed. After the three had finished their meals, the waitress came to fetch their plates. "Finished?" she asked, eager to get them out of the restaurant. Pinky smiled widely. "Dessert?" she asked. The waitress sighed, pulled out her pad of paper and pen, and tapped her foot impatiently.
"I will have the double chocolate sundae,"
Chris exclaimed. "Pie a la mode, without the a la mode," Dan said, still doing an old money voice. Whoops. Pinky looked across the table to someone's yellow drink with a red tint on top. "Ooh, what's that?" she asked excitedly. The waitress looked behind her and sighed. "Strawberry lemonade," she answered flatly. "Sounds delicious. I love strawberries and lemonade." "Be like disappointment, too," Dan muttered, forgetting he was still pretending to be someone else. Pinky glanced at him. Dan decided to clear his throat for about the next 30 seconds to detour suspicion, and Chris prayed they'd get out of the restaurant without further incident. It was not to be. The waitress soon returned with their order, along with a check, placing all the dessert items in front of them with a slip of paper. Pinky took a sip of her drink, leaned her head under the table, and quickly spit what she had sipped on the floor. she exclaimed. Chris increased his pace of eating, sensing he had very little time to consume his dessert. "What is this?" Pinky asked, with a disgusted look on her face, motioning at her beverage. The waitress sighed, a sound the occupants of the table were getting used to. "It's what you ordered, ma'am." Dan waved his hand dismissively. "Only if she ordered artificially colored sugar water with synthetic lemon and strawberry flavors," he said in his regular tone of voice. Pinky's face went red. "Fake lemons and strawberries? Fake lemons and strawberries?" she screamed at the top of her lungs. Chris feverishly attempted to devour his sundae. "Ma'am, if you'd like something else, I'm sure..." "Why, so you can serve us more lies and poison?" "Yeah!" Chris grabbed his head, having consumed way too much ice cream way too fast. "And now they're trying to get to Chris, too. Well, no dice. Tell Mr. Lenny that we've seen through his twisted web of decent and murder." Pinky turned to Dan. "Mr. Moneybags," Pinky called out with an authority. Dan hopped to his feet, wide-eyed. "Grab Chris and run!" Dan grabbed his friend, who rose to his feet. Before either could process what was going on, Pinky grabbed her glass and point-blank threw the contents into the face of the waitress. The waitress wasted no time in clutching at her face, collapsing to the ground and screaming, "High fructose corn syrup! Only weakness! Oh!" as she writhed in agony. The three bolted for the door. Once outside, Chris sprinted for his car. Pinky stopped and grabbed Dan's hand, causing him to turn and face her. She leaned down, put her mouth within an inch of his ear, and whispered, "We'll be at the mall next." With that, she jumped in the car with Chris. The blue sedan sped off into the distance. Dan quickly made himself scarce, stripping back down to his jeans and jerk shirt, and started walking back to his car, clutching most of his disguise. He opted to keep wearing the hat, not wanting to damage it. He pondered his next move. Maybe friendship with Pinky wouldn't be so bad. After I've had my revenge, of course.
The end.